Hey, long time no see. Welcome back to our YouTube channel, and we're gonna have a nice review for Monster Menu. Such is the desire of Nippon Ichi Software to enrich its catalog of video games, which has always been overshadowed by the success of Disgaea, from having tried to produce everything in the last 10 years. Exponents of the survival horror genre, Super Sentai-themed roguelikes, platform titles inspired by children's fairy tales, and hack and slash of all kinds have populated the list of recent releases from the Japanese company, without ever really taking root. It is difficult to create something more characteristic of Laharl and his eclectic company of devils and angels, but undoubtedly this drive to experiment with low-budget projects has allowed enthusiasts of some video game genres to feed themselves for years of titles with a limited spectrum, but with always interesting mechanics. Monster Menu, the Scavenger's Cookbook, is part of this production line, proposing itself as an interesting three-dimensional dungeon crawler in which roguelike mechanics and the typical chessboard clash system that one would expect from the authors of Disgaea coexist. Awakened with no memory in a labyrinth full of mysteries, we struggle to ensure survival. It will be precisely the desire to continue living that will push the protagonist avatar to feed on what appears, to all intents and purposes, the limb of a monstrosity with the appearance similar to that of an insect, and it is from that moment that it takes off the exploration of the labyrinthine depths. Monster Menu, the Scavenger's Cookbook, shares many points in common with independent productions focused on this kind of mechanics, proposing the exploration of random labyrinths, the collection of equipment with special characteristics, and the addition of clashes with multitudes of roaming enemies undisturbed in the darkness of these settings. Each game ended with a game over, takes the player back to the starting point of the adventure, but allows you to keep the equipment collected up to that moment. The novelty, if we want to consider it this way, which is added to a more than well-tested format, is the possibility of cooking, creating personalized recipes and prepared with each element collected during the adventure, experimenting with the creation of objects and meals capable of modifying in a clear way the stats of your scouting party. Eating the best meals does not ensure victory. It is the union of these mechanics, together with crafting, the management of water and food, and the upgrading of one's equipment, to determine one's supremacy on the field, even net of a system of turn-based combat with board-based movement that brings to mind the complexity of some tactical RPGs. To be honest, one could dwell precisely on the combat system to notice how, net of a rich scaffolding of mechanics and menus dedicated to the min-maxing of statistics and skills, the clashes are the least interesting point of the whole project. It is possible to create a group of adventurers consisting of up to 4 explorers, taking advantage of a simple class system that pigeons the characters into certain roles typical of the genre, such as the wizard, the swordsman, and so on. These characters can actually unleash other types of weapons on the battlefield from the default one, but they are naturally more inclined to evolve their combat techniques if the weapon that suits them is used. Thus, by gathering experience and repeating the same offensive techniques ad nauseum in the first hours of the game, we begin to take advantage of various special moves. In my case, I used everything that kept me at a safe distance from the enemies. What if you fell in battle? Don't worry, just feed on one of the exhausted monsters nearby to recover energy and benefit from temporary bonuses, or even from the lifeless bodies of your adventure companions. Failure, which equates to the death of only the group's leader, is never really a problem. Restarting the adventure with previously collected equipment, combined with the group's new culinary skills, allows you to start with a distinct advantage as you progress. One goes from exploration to exploration into the depths of the labyrinth. In this sense, the alters Monster Menu. The Scavenger's Cookbook is clearly a game focused on making the sum of its playful mechanics its only real offer, deputing the graphics sector to a bunch of cel-shaded polygonal models for heroes and enemies, with the task of staging the action and carry the story forward. The explorable labyrinths, although not devoid of morphological complexity, do not offer anything particularly memorable, no unique event, nothing that can really amaze after only a few hours of play. And this is perhaps the most painful point of the entire production. The unpredictability factor typical of the genre, capable of characterizing each game with some curiosity, is almost completely absent. The sound is instead held together by a small number of songs repeated endlessly, and a practically absent dubbing, even when it would have been more than welcome in the few cutscenes that try to give more narrative context to the adventure of the protagonist and to the origins of the labyrinth in which you find yourself a prisoner. In this sense, having to invest a large part of the time juggling the menus when one should decide to camp to examine the potential ingredients collected during the exploration. One sometimes comes across documents that tell the unspoken lore of a narrative universe that is far too sketchy to be even remotely interesting. Curiously, it is possible to censor the illustrations that explicitly show the dishes created during the cooking sessions. Perhaps it is an attempt to accommodate the more impressionable people. It shouldn't be surprising, given that in the video game you will end up really eating anything if necessary. I played Monster Menu, the scavenger's cookbook, thanks to a review code provided to me by the game publisher. I've spent over 30 hours exploring the various environments that make up the floors of the labyrinth, always learning something new with each attempt, and upgrading my party's equipment to infuse it with new characteristics otherwise impossible to track down. And I plan to do it for as many hours at higher difficulty levels. The PS5 version of the game performs flawlessly in every situation, but I want to remind you that Nippon Ichi Software's game is also available on PS4 and Nintendo Switch. Verdict: if you feel like testing your tenacity, Monster Menu, the Scavenger's Cookbook could be a game to give a chance. The set of gameplay mechanics requires time and a certain dedication to be fully understood, and you certainly cannot remain indifferent if you have already been enchanted in the past by other similar titles in the Nippon Ichi Software catalog. Too bad that in this sense the production efforts are really at historic lows, with a barely sufficient graphic sector and an artistic direction that, beyond the author's character design, is practically non-existent. It goes without saying, but whenever you bite the dust in Monster Menu, the Scavenger's Cookbook, and have to start all over again, it can be a huge bummer. Sometimes this will happen simply due to you being unlucky, which just doesn't feel fair. For example, I once had a massive boss emerge and wipe out my whole party in one swoop. I'm still not sure if that was a random event or if I triggered it somehow, but either way, it put a sour look on my face. Thankfully, there are plenty of items that carry over, such as equipment, which is awesome, especially when you have a sweet loadout. Oh, and recipes, special notes, and such are invaluable and rewarding collectibles.